Once upon a time, in the far, far east, high up in the mountains, was a tiny little village by the name of Peng. This village was known for its noodles. In fact, there was even a myth that in this town, the noodles were magical. I can hear you laughing and asking, how can noodles be magical? The story began many, many years ago on a rainy Monday morning before the crack of dawn. Mr. Yan, the village noodle maker, was frantically whipping up a batch of noodle dough so that he could take it to the richest man in town and maybe, just maybe, be hired as his personal noodle maker. So there he was, pounding away, pulling and pushing and squeezing and squishing the noodle dough when his little daughter ran in through the door of the noodle shop, holding something carefully in her hands. "Daddy! Daddy!" Impatiently, Mr. Yan pushed the child away, but in all her excitement, she managed to drop the precious object in her hand straight into the noodle dough her father was kneading. "Aye, child, what have you done? This dough was meant to secure our future. What did you drop in there?" the noodle maker cried out. "It was nothing, Daddy. Nothing." "Away, child, I am busy," Mr. Yan yelled, and the little girl ran out of the shop again. Sighing with frustration, the noodle maker took his anger out on the dough, ever pounding harder and harder, his fists beating the dough with a fury, and slowly, something odd began to happen. The dough began to glow. And when Mr. Yan pounded it hard enough, it even gave off a spark or two. By the time the noodle maker believed his eyes, the dough was illuminating the entire noodle shop. He cried out for Mrs. Yan, who came running through the door at once. At the sight of the dough and the sparks in the air, she stopped. For the first time in her life, she was utterly and completely speechless. Her mouth opened, and at first only a few squawks came out, and then her mind was working so hard you could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. "What if?" she began. Yes, yes," her husband interrupted impatiently. "What if we make noodles from this dough?" "Ah, you silly woman," reprimanded the noodle maker. "Of course we make noodles out of it. We are noodle makers. That is what we do." "We will take the noodles to the richest man in town, as planned," she said calmly. "When he sees these golden noodles, you will have no choice but to hire us as his own personal noodle makers. We will be rich," explained the noodle maker's wife. "But dear, we don't actually know what is happening here, or whether he might die from eating these noodles," worried the noodle maker. "Well," answered Mrs. Yan, "I doubt it can do any more harm." The rich man had been bedridden for over 3 years now, ever since his only daughter had disappeared in the middle of the night. His heart was shattered. His daughter had been all he had left, and when he lost her, he lost his will to live. By the time the noodle maker and his wife were ready to set off to the rich man's house, the noodles had curled themselves obediently and neatly into the basket, letting off only a slight golden glow hidden by a cloth. From a distance, the house seemed quite large and overwhelming, but the closer they got, the darker and more forbidding it appeared to be. When they reached the huge wooden door, they knocked carefully 3 times. "Who's there?" screeched the voice from the other side of the door. "It's the noodle makers. We are here to offer our services," called the noodle maker's wife. "Hey, you will be lucky. We have already had 99 noodle makers visit us today." A tiny old woman stood behind the door, peering up at the noodle maker and his wife. "All right, you 2 noodles, come with me." And she hobbled off down a dark corridor full of sadness and despair. The husband and wife followed with their precious basket of noodles, but with every step they felt more and more doubtful about their presence in the house. From outside, the house was beautiful, but the inside, it had no soul. After walking up and down stairs, in and out of neglected and dusty rooms, they finally came to a small door. And instead of light, darkness poured from behind the door, more and more darkness. "Eh, what do you have here?" screeched the old woman. "Noodles don't glow." "It must be your eyes playing tricks on you in the dark. There is no glow," the noodle maker cried out. I'm keeping my eyes on you too," the old woman muttered, and moved deeper into the dark, dark room beyond the black door. It took a while for the couple's eyes to become used to the darkness. "What's going on? Who's there?" "It's just another noodle maker with some noodles for you," screeched the old bat. "Send them away. I am sick to death of noodles," wavered the voice. By this time, the couple had already unpacked the noodles and a delicious smell was filling the air. "Well, wait," whispered the old man. "That does smell wonderful." Steam was rising from the noodles, but it was no ordinary steam. It spiraled and swirled and formed shapes and stars and sparkled and was almost like fireworks. "Maybe 1 bowl wouldn't do me any harm," sighed the old man. The rich man grasped the bowl with two pale, skinny hands. He dipped his chopsticks into the bowl, and a thin tendril of steam began to curl around the chopstick, higher and higher, and then another joined it, and now there were two dancing around the chopsticks, and now 3, and 4, and now 5. Eventually, he had eaten so much that the room was filled with light, and at this point, the rich old man realized something was happening, and he looked up. In the air directly in front of him, tendrils of golden steam were beginning to form a shape. Slowly, the form of a woman could be seen, and all around her were the tendrils of gold, like fire. The light spread all over the bed, all over him, and into his eyes. A soft but firm voice was heard. "Remember me." The noodle maker and his wife stood in the corner of the room, terrified out of their wits but unable to look away from the brilliant light. "Who are you?" cried out the old man. "It's your daughter. No parent should have to outlive their child," the voice continued. "By the grace of God, I have been given a second chance." The old man's eyes opened wide, and he reached up to the light and grasped the hand of the golden being, his daughter. "My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces when I lost you." Pulling away slightly, the glowing being smiled. She placed her brilliant hand upon his chest, and it began to glow. And as it glowed, the light that was in the room began to spread to the other rooms in the house. More and more light everywhere, spilling to corridors and cupboards, through bedrooms and bathrooms. Nowhere could the darkness hide. The rich man and his golden daughter stayed close for a long time. And in time, she began to fade as the steam from the noodles faded, as the noodles grew cold. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked at the noodle maker and his wife. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." The rich man was loyal to that noodle shop until the day he died. Again and again, Mr. Yon went over the events of that fateful day, asking his little daughter over and over again what she had dropped in the dough. "I told you, Daddy, it was a kiss." And each time, the noodle maker and his wife would smile at each other as if to say, "Oh, the nonsense of children." But the truth was, they couldn't think of a better explanation for the events that day, no matter how hard they tried. And they lived happily ever after. The end.